Hello, I wanted to talk a little bit about anxiety, the nervous system, and the limbic system, and how they're all kind of interrelated. I'm going to talk about the main divisions of the nervous system, and then we're going to talk about all these other parts. So we're going to look at the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and then we're going to look at the peripheral nervous system, which is everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. Within that peripheral nervous system, we have a somatic and an autonomic nervous system. And then within that autonomic nervous system, we have a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system that are really important to understanding anxiety and our anxiety response. And then we also have a limbic system that's involved in memory and emotions and motivation. That's really important to understand for psychology as well. So we have two main divisions of our nervous system. We talked about this already, the central nervous system, our brain, and our spinal cord. And our spinal cord is actually able to act independently of the brain on occasion. If you've ever touched a hot stove and your hand is already coming off of that hot stove before you even realize what happened, that's actually your spinal cord reflexes kicking in and pulling your hand off of the stove without any involvement from your brain. And then once the whole thing's over, your brain gets the information and you go, oh yeah, that was stupid. But the spinal cord is capable of some reflexive actions without the interaction of the brain there. But what we're really interested in is more of the peripheral nervous system. And this is everything that's outside of the brain and spinal cord. And you see these sort of spaghetti-like noodles here. These are not bones. These are all bundles of axons that you hopefully remember from the talk about neurons. These are all bundles of axons that help messages get sent throughout the whole peripheral nervous system. This is an actual nervous system that's been taken out of somebody's body, and this is a real brain and a real spinal cord, and then these are all the axons of the peripheral nervous system, and it just helps to get information quickly and efficiently throughout the body. So within this peripheral nervous system, there are two divisions. There's a somatic nervous system that controls our voluntary movements and behavior, carries messages from our sense organs and our skeletal muscles to the brain. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, which is a little bit more interesting and more related to anxiety. So the autonomic nervous system is sometimes referred to as the automatic nervous system. It serves our internal organs and glands. It controls things like our automatic functions like heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, perspiration, things that we don't really think about that just kind of automatically happen. But within this autonomic nervous system, we have two different systems that are very related to anxiety. We have our sympathetic nervous system, and this creates really our fight or flight response. So it gets us aroused for an emergency. And anxiety gets involved when it's responding to what it thinks is a threat, but that isn't an actual threat. So we'll talk about that in the next slide here. The parasympathetic nervous system is the sympathetic nervous system. It's the nervous system that's operating when the sympathetic nervous system is not activated, and it actually helps us calm down after an emergency. So the sympathetic nervous system arouses us. It's our emergency system. It's our fight, flight, or freeze system, and it's really important if we're dealing with an angry bear. It helps us get revved up for that emergency. I don't know if you've ever noticed that when you're stressed out, a lot of times your mouth is kind of dry, you might have bad breath, your heart might race. If you have an anxiety attack, you might feel sick to your stomach, you might have a racing heart. And the difference between an anxiety attack and like a panic attack is that usually when we have an anxiety attack, we know what we're stressed out about, we're stressed, we know we're stressed, and a lot of times we can sort of talk ourselves down from those anxiety attacks. And that's actually our sympathetic nervous system kicking in because it thinks that there's an emergency. And the interesting thing about the sympathetic nervous system is that it gets activated whether it's a real emergency or an imagined emergency or a thought about emergency or a remembered emergency. It kicks in and gets activated, and sometimes the stress response that we get is really uncomfortable, and a lot of people try to avoid having to have these symptoms. People who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder have trouble sometimes shutting down the sympathetic nervous system. They're often really on high alert constantly, and a lot of times they might have a memory that's triggered by something that happens, and it sends them right back into that moment when they had a traumatic event, and brings back that rush of emotions and the rush of the sympathetic nervous system and all of these bodily responses that can be pretty uncomfortable for some people. The parasympathetic system helps us calm back down after a threat or an emotional event, and it's active when we're at rest, when there isn't a threat that we're dealing with. So the sympathetic nervous system kicks in when there's a threat, and sometimes it can misinterpret worry or stress, and create these symptoms and really increase our anxiety level. So this is an example of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system and what they do. So the sympathetic nervous system dilates our pupil, it inhibits the flow of saliva, so that's why you get bad breath. It revs up our heart, it opens up our lungs and helps us breathe better. It inhibits digestion because we don't need to be digesting food when we're running away from a bear. It secretes noradrenaline so that we can have some extra energy, and then it inhibits bladder contraction, and that's why sometimes people pee their pants when they get really stressed out. So the limbic system is involved in memory, emotions, and motivation. So the amygdala is this little purple, I don't even know what you'd call that, blob, right here in the picture, and it's our emotional center of the brain. So it processes all of our emotions, and it's sitting here right on top of this green caterpillar looking thing that's called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is involved in memory storage and learning. And it's interesting that the amygdala sits right there on top of it, because we know that emotional memories are much stronger a lot of times than just memories that we're trying to learn for a class. Whenever we have an emotional memory, it's usually stored very solidly in our brain. The hypothalamus is kind of this purple triangle in here, and it controls our basic drives, things like hunger, sex, and sleep. We're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail here. So the hippocampus, this green caterpillar thing, is responsible for creating new memories. It transfers information from short-term memory to long-term memory. If you have damage to your hippocampus, it causes you to be unable to create new long-term memories. So you're always living in the present. And so it's a really strange deficit to have. So the book talked about the case of HM, and this was a man named Henry Meliason. And I think he had a head injury as a kid, and he had really severe seizures, and they were all centered around the hippocampus. And at the time, scientists didn't know what the hippocampus did, but they thought, hey, let's remove that part of the brain where the seizures are occurring and see if that helps with the seizures. Well, it helped with the seizures, but pretty soon they recognized that HN had a lot of deficits that he didn't have before, and that he couldn't make new memories. HM would get up every morning and look at himself in the mirror, and he didn't really understand why he looked older. He thought it was the same day. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie 50 First Dates with Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler. She gets into a car accident, and she has damage to her hippocampus, so she has lost her ability to get memories into her long-term memory. So she keeps going on a date with Adam Sandler and thinking he's a new guy, and her family are kind of in cahoots with each other, trying to not let her know what's wrong. So she just thinks it's all the same day every day, and a few years from then, it will become apparent that that's not going to work. But it's not a terribly uncommon injury. Sometimes when people have head injuries like car accidents and things like that, the brain may get shaken up, and there may be a lot of swelling around the hippocampus, and they may have some short-term memory loss, but it's temporary. So once that swelling goes down, they regain that ability to have short-term memories. But there are people with permanent short-term memory loss. This movie Memento is a really good movie. We'll talk about this when we talk about memory. But it's about a man that had short-term memory loss after a head injury, and witnessing his wife being murdered. And the whole movie is him trying to catch his wife's killer, except for he can't remember moment to moment. It's kind of hard to follow it, but it's a very good movie. We also know that the hippocampus is one of the areas affected by Alzheimer's, so we know it's really important to memory. And no, this is kind of odd information, but serial killers have been shown to have an asymmetrical hippocampus. And what that means is we actually have two hippocampus or hippocampi, one on each side of the brain or one in each of the lobes of the brain. So we have a right and a left lobe of the brain, and then we have a right and left hippocampus. We also have an amygdala on both sides as well. And about the hypothalamus is kind of in the middle there, so I'm not sure about that. So the amygdala is the emotional center of our brain. It processes all of our emotions, and it's our primitive fear response. So it actually activates that sympathetic nervous system whenever we're dealing with any sort of danger or emergency. They call it the primitive fear response because the amygdala is actually able to put together sensory information and act on it, kind of like that spinal cord reflex. If you've ever heard like screeching brakes or something and you're jumping out of the way before you even realize what's really happening, that's your amygdala kicking in, sensing danger, and getting you out of the way. And actually your spinal cord's probably involved in that as well. But the amygdala is the kind of the first to sense that danger. And so the amygdala will also kick in your anxiety response and that fight, flight, or freeze response as well. So it activates that sympathetic nervous system when it senses danger. And it seems to be overactive in anxiety sufferers. There was a new study that was done using MRIs to look at people's amygdalas or study people's amygdala that suffered from severe anxiety. And then they compared their amygdalas to people with normal levels of anxiety. And what they found was that people that had severe anxiety had enlarged amygdalas. They had more connections within those amygdalas, thicker connections, thicker neural connections, larger fear centers, and so there definitely is a link between the amygdala and anxiety. And of course, we know it's involved in processing emotions as well. But they did a study where they actually taught people coping skills, gave them counseling, stress management skills, and they actually were able to see some reversal in these thicker connections and the enlargement of the amygdala. So it's interesting to think that psychologically you can actually affect your brain structures, and that you can also change it. If you change your thinking, you change your stress level, you can actually shrink that amygdala back to a more normal size as well. So really interesting. Serial killers seem to have amygdala abnormalities too. One of the reasons why a lot of criminals, not just serial killers, can easily pass polygraph tests is that it measures your heart rate and your galvanic skin response, which is actually sweating. And serial killers and criminals oftentimes can lie without any sort of anxiety at all. So their heart rate is very stable. They have a low resting heart rate. They have a very low emotional response. They don't sweat. So they can pass the test, but that doesn't mean they're telling the truth. So interesting. And also when we look at autism, that's a problem where kids can't have difficulty understanding emotions of other people, reading emotions of other people, and also difficulty controlling their own emotions. And there may be some faulty connections in the amygdala there as well. These are all research that's still being done. They're not 100% accurate, but we definitely know that the amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. And this poor little mouse, another way we know why different parts of the brains do different things is we do a lot of rat studies where we may go in with an electrode and destroy a part of the brain and then see what deficits the poor little rat has. So this little rat has no amygdala and it has absolutely no fear of this cat. It has no idea what's going to happen there. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus likes to maintain equilibrium or homeostasis, which is just a healthy, stable internal environment. The hypothalamus doesn't want us to be thirsty. It doesn't want us to be hungry. It doesn't want us to be tired. So it helps regulate our sleep-wake cycles, our sexual behavior, other drives like appetite and hunger. And I don't know why I put this down here. But the hypothalamus is right in there. I guess maybe I just put it there. And this is actually the hypothalamus in an MRI image, which is a really interesting image just because it's so clear and you can see a lot of detail in there. And this is it's not so little rat, I guess, that has had its hypothalamus destroyed. So they go in with an electrode, they destroy the hypothalamus, and what happened was this poor little rat always felt hungry, never felt full, just ate and ate until it can probably no longer walk. So we know the hypothalamus is definitely involved in appetite and hunger. So that is it. Thanks for listening.